Deterrence is not really an accurate science. You make a lot of assumptions about how your adversary perceives different capabilities and how that then shapes their actions. But if you get that calculus wrong, then the outcome could be something like the destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but many times over.
Now, this week marks 81 years since the dropping of the two atomic bombs, Fat Man and Fat Man on Nagasaki was the second bomb. In total, some 70,000 people are estimated to have died from the radiation impact of the atomic bomb. That remains the last time that nuclear weapons were actually used in the world, but their creation defined much of the Cold War and the period since. It is estimated 9 nations now own nuclear weapons, and others, such as Israel, are not declaring whether they have them. So we thought this week we'd open up the archive, marking the dropping of the atomic bombs, to look at the capabilities that have developed since 1945 in the 20th and 21st centuries. And joining us to look at that is Dr Marion Messmer, Programme Director on International Security at Chatham House. Hello to you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, let's just go back to the dropping of the two atomic bombs, which led to the Japanese surrender and the end of the Second World War, the war in the East. The bombs were named Little Boy and Fat Man was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's President Truman announcing the first atomic bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
Obviously an awful weapon with many, many casualties, Dr. Messmer, but how did it change strategic thinking around the world that this weapon was now available, certainly to the United States?
It changed strategic thinking significantly because before that, up until the end of the Second World War, we had essentially seen an increase of conventional conflict between various states. And World War I and then World War II were kind of seen as the most extreme forms of that. And in the European memory, we often still think back to the many soldiers that were lost in both of those wars. And so what the nuclear century brought in was essentially a strategic adjustment where it was thought, because you had such terrible weapons, first only at the hands of the United States, but soon also at the hands of the Soviet Union, and then the UK, France, and China eventually. The idea essentially was that these superpowers would be a lot less likely to engage in conventional conflict with each other, because there was always the risk that you would escalate up to the nuclear level. And that did work to an extent, but it is also a really difficult balance. Deterrence is not really an accurate science. You make a lot of assumptions about how your adversary perceives different capabilities and how that then shapes their actions. But if you get that calculus wrong, then the outcome could be something like the destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but many times over. I mean, at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had so many nuclear weapons pointed at each other that they could have destroyed both countries many times over, and then the secondary impacts of all of those nuclear explosions would have very likely led to nuclear winter, which would have probably killed many more thousands of people all across the world. So that's the huge difference between having a nuclear arsenal and not having nuclear weapons prior to 1945.
And of course, the result was an arms race during the Cold War for the development of nuclear weapons, and the SSR, the Soviet predecessor to what we now know as Russia, tested RDS-1 atomic bombs in Kazakhstan, and by 1952 the US was upping the arms race with the test of Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen bomb. Then in 1953 the USSR detonated their own hydrogen weapon, RDS-6. By 1961 they detonated the Tsar bomber. This is all nuclear tests, and that was the last nuclear weapon ever exploded in human history. Now, the competition led to serious tensions, obviously, between the United States and the USSR. And in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place when the US intended to plant Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which could strike Moscow, and US spy planes could sight nuclear sites in Cuba being put in by the USSR, the Soviets, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The tension, the confrontation, lasted 13 days, after which the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, and the US agreed never to attack Cuba and also to withdraw missiles from Turkey. Here's President John F. Kennedy speaking about the weapons they found in Cuba.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Well, thanks to Associated Press for that clip. And, of course, what was going on, Dr. Messmer, really was a sort of acceleration of positioning nuclear weapons around the world, really, by both sides.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what's really incredible about the Cuban Missile Crisis is the speed at which it developed. And this was in a time before the internet. It was in a time when the presidents really only could communicate either via telephone directly or via their embassies in the other city. And so they had much more time to think about how they wanted to react, what they wanted their next move to be. Whereas if we were to face a similar crisis today, then decision making would be much quicker and communication would be much quicker, which on the one hand could be good for de-escalation, but on the other hand, if we look at the many moments where the Cuban Missile Crisis could have developed very differently, you can also see how actually escalation could happen much more quickly. And so the other thing that I think is really striking about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that it was the first moment where both the US president and the Soviet president realized that actually maybe an unfettered arms race wasn't necessarily a good thing. And on the back of that, they then started various arms reduction talks, which led to the sort of architecture of arms control agreements that we then had with us for a lot of the Cold War and well into the 1990s and early 2000s. And so you can see how this one crisis essentially really highlighted what the risk was of having nuclear missiles stationed close to the other, and what that then meant for strategic stability. And then, of course, bringing in intercontinental ballistic missiles, so very large missiles that could essentially target the Soviet Union from the US and vice versa, meant that it was a lot less important to have missiles stationed close to the other's territory going forward.
But there was also a significant shift with the arrival of Merming, having multiple independent re-entry vehicles, effectively warheads, making it more difficult to guarantee a defence against a nuclear attack. But also in the 1980s, people turned to so-called tactical nuclear weapons. The idea, of course, of locating them in Europe became very controversial and led to the Greenham Common protests. We can listen to one of the anti-Greenham Common campaigners, Anne Pettit, speaking in 1982 about the Greenham Common camp against the deployment of those missiles.
We decided to call it a peace camp and decided to stay, asking for a public debate between everybody in this country about the sighting of cruise missiles.
And how significant do you think that change was towards thinking about intermediate range nuclear missiles or battlefield nuclear weapons, as they've sometimes been called?
Well, bringing in tactical nuclear weapons was essentially a Soviet response to what they saw as conventional superiority that NATO had over them. So the Soviet Union ended up relying much more on their nuclear arsenal because they thought that their conventional armed forces and their conventional capabilities could not match up with what NATO had in a conflict situation.
But then NATO wanted to match that, of course.
Exactly. NATO was then concerned that if they couldn't match that as a deterrent, then the Soviet Union would be incentivized to use tactical nuclear weapons early in a conflict. And that's essentially a dynamic that is back on the table now, because Russia still has a much larger tactical nuclear weapons arsenal, and so now that Russia is again weakened conventionally through the war in Ukraine, this is something that the US as well as European nuclear weapon states are discussing, because they're not quite sure how to match that.
Now, today there are, I think, 9 officially declared nuclear states, including, of course, the permanent 5 on the United Nations, and that includes the UK. Here's Theresa May as Prime Minister making the case in the Commons for Britain's nuclear deterrent.
Our national interest is clear. Britain's nuclear deterrent is an insurance policy we simply cannot do without. We cannot compromise on our national security. We cannot outsource the grave responsibility we shoulder for keeping our people safe. And we cannot abandon our ultimate safeguard out of misplaced idealism. That would be a reckless gamble, a gamble that would enfeeble our allies and embolden our enemies. A gamble with the safety and security of families in Britain that we must never be prepared to take. Mr. Speaker, we have waited long enough. It is time to get on with building the next generation of our nuclear deterrent. It is time to take this essential decision to deter the most extreme threats to our society and preserve our way of life for generations to come.
Dr. Messmer, other comparable countries, I mean, Italy, Germany, Spain, they don't have a nuclear weapon. France does. Is Theresa May right there, what she says, that we do need a nuclear deterrent?
Well, the interesting thing is that she came to that conclusion in a very different strategic environment, right? So I think especially today in 2026, if we're looking at the security environment in Europe, then I think the UK is not in a position to be able to disarm, especially not unilaterally, because we know that Russia is deterred by UK nuclear weapons, and Russia cares a lot that the UK has actually also said that its nuclear weapons are in service of NATO, whereas, for example, France, which is also a NATO member state, it says that it keeps its nuclear weapons sort of for its national deterrence, and now in this newfound European deterrence arrangement, but French nuclear weapons are not part of NATO capabilities. And so especially given that there are some uncertainties about how the relationship between the US and European NATO states will continue to evolve going forward, that has sort of given additional importance to UK nuclear weapons. I do think that it's really important to also think about what else deters. It's not just nuclear weapons that deter, and we do know that Russia also really cares about a conventional mismatch, and the UK is not as strong when it comes to conventional capabilities as other NATO member states are. So this is something that's not to be neglected. But at the same time, I do think it would be misplaced at this point in 2026 to think about the UK disarming, because the European security environment is simply not in that position.
So far, we've largely been talking about, in Cold War terms, of the West versus the Soviets or its successors. What about nuclear proliferation to Asia? What happened there?
Yeah, I mean, that's also something that's a huge concern at this point in time, right? I mean, China acquired nuclear weapons in the 60s and was then for a long time a relatively stable nuclear state, in the sense that it had a relatively small arsenal that was comparable to the nuclear arsenals of the UK and France. And it said that it had a no first use policy. So essentially meaning that China said that its nuclear weapons were only to deter a first strike against China, but that it would never be the country that would use nuclear weapons first. But what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is that the Chinese nuclear arsenal has really grown, and China is not very transparent about why it has been growing its nuclear arsenal. So there are all sorts of concerns about whether that means that China is abandoning its no first use policy, or what that might mean for regional security. And so occasionally you also hear countries like South Korea talk about whether they actually want to acquire nuclear weapons in order to be able to deter either North Korea, who became nuclear in early in the 2000s, or China. And so I think increasing essentially the proliferation of nuclear weapons across Asia would be a huge security concern. And we have the US take all sorts of steps to make sure that that doesn't happen. So, for example, the Biden administration increased the number of submarine rotations that went through South Korea to essentially assure Korean allies that the US was still sticking with its extended deterrence commitments and would look after South Korea if there was to be an emergency.
But already we had India testing nuclear weapons in the 1970s and again in 1998, and Pakistan also tested a weapon in 1998. Here's the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, Amjad Ahmed Khan, speaking in 1998 after Pakistan had conducted 5 tests.
All the tests conducted were fully contained. There was no release of radioactivity. The results were as expected. The devices tested correspond to weapons configuration compatible with delivery system.
And of course, in Asia, we also have North Korea, which really has built its economy around being a nuclear power. Dr.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
Hey, Dr. Messmer, it doesn't seem that threats like those we heard from Donald Trump, or indeed previously towards India and Pakistan, have stopped proliferation.
No, I mean, that's the really difficult thing. It seems that once a country actually acquires nuclear weapons, there's not much more that can be done. We've only had one example of a country essentially getting rid of a nuclear weapons program, and that's South Africa in 1990. And other than that, countries essentially decided when they were in the process of developing nuclear weapons.
Ukraine would say it gave up its nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, the Ukrainian nuclear weapons were part of the USSR nuclear program, so that was different because it wasn't an independent nuclear weapons program. And I mean, there are expert assessments out there that say that Ukraine would have actually struggled to maintain an independent nuclear arsenal. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And so I think, you know, the important moment when we're talking about non-proliferation is essentially trying to prevent countries from acquiring nuclear weapons in the first place, such as was the case with Iran, right, where there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran deal, that put severe limitations on Iran's nuclear program to make sure that it stayed a civilian nuclear program. But unfortunately, it does seem to be the case that once a state reaches the status of a nuclear armed state, it's incredibly difficult to undo that unless the government of that state is willing to collaborate in that effort.
Then there's the question of what weapons Israel has. Here is CNN's Chris Cuomo asking Prime Minister Netanyahu about that in 2018.
Does Israel have nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons? Yes or no?
We've always said that we won't be the first to introduce it, so we haven't introduced it.
But that's not an answer to the question. Do you have them or do you not?
Of any country. It's as good an answer as you're going to get. But I'll tell you one thing, Chris, and I think it's important. You know, Iran signed NPT. Iran signed all sorts of commitments. Iran said that they don't have this nuclear weapons program. And Iran calls daily for the annihilation of my country.
What do you reckon, Dr. Messmer? Is Israel a nuclear power?
Well, I mean, as the clip just showed, Israel has never officially declared that they have nuclear weapons, but it is assumed that they do have nuclear weapons. And there was an explosion in the early 70s that essentially is assumed to be Israel's nuclear test. So we won't know for sure, but the assumption essentially is that Israel has a small nuclear weapons program.
And finally, they haven't been used since the bombings of Japan in 1945. Do you think the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons is going up or down?
If you compare the period in the 1990s to now, then I would say the likelihood has gone up. If we compare today to various crisis moments in the Cold War, then perhaps the likelihood is a little lower than it was during those moments of crisis. But I think the really important thing is that we now have 8 or 9 nuclear armed states, and the sort of political relationships between them have become a lot more complicated. So, you know, China is not just worried about its relationship with the US, it is also to an extent worried about its relationship with Russia, and it is worried about its relationship with India. And so India is not just worried about its relationship with Pakistan, it's also keeping a close eye on China and the sort of border competition there. So for almost every single nuclear armed state, they are no longer just concerned with one adversary, but they are concerned with at least 2 adversaries. And so that creates a much more unstable situation, because if any of those state postures change, even if they change in response to what one adversary did, the other adversary is also going to take notice and adjust their posture. So I think that's essentially the really tricky puzzle that we need to solve in the 21st century, that we've not quite managed to solve, how to make sure that we do not get to a nuclear catastrophe and that nuclear weapons aren't used again, while state relationships are much more volatile today than they have been in a very long time.
Dr. Marion Messmer of Chatham House, thank you very much indeed.